Hey everyone, you are listening to the Divergent Conversations podcast. We are two neurodivergent mental health professionals in a neurotypical world. I'm Patrick Casale.
And I'm Dr. Neff.
And during these episodes, we do talk about sensitive subjects, mental health, and there are some conversations that can certainly feel a bit overwhelming. So we do just want to use that disclosure and disclaimer before jumping in. And thanks for listening. Hey everyone, welcome back to Divergent Conversations. We are here today with Jes Hagen, who is a nutritional therapist and a national board certified health and wellness board certified integrative menstrual health educator and coach, who is also the founder of Her Mood Mentor, a virtual premenstrual clinic. And we are going to talk about PMDD today, PMS, the linkages in neurodivergence, and really excited to have you on. A couple of people on our post made mention of you and that they really wanted to hear you come on here and talk about some of this stuff. So thanks for making the time.
Thanks for having me, Patrick and Megan. I'm so excited.
So Megan was mentioning before we started recording, she's like, I don't know how much you're going to add to this conversation today. And that may be true. And I may just sit here and do a lot of nodding. But we really want to turn it over to you, especially because these topics keep coming up, like PMDD, PMS, hormonal imbalances and struggles, and the linkages between neurodivergence. So Jes, tell us a little bit about who you are and some of that stuff that's on your bio that I didn't get to, because I think that's an important segue into what we're about to talk about.
Sure. So I came into this work not by choice, as many of us do, more by lived experience. And that was living with PMDD, misdiagnosed and undiagnosed for 17 years, which was brutal. And I think it might help to just define some terms getting started. PMDD, Premenstrual Dysphoric Disorder, is what the PMDD stands for. It's a mouthful. And it is a reproductive mood disorder linked to the menstrual cycle. So it's cyclical. Whereas PMS, premenstrual syndrome, is more linked to hormonal imbalance. PMDD is a neurosteroid sensitivity in the brain to the normal fluctuation of hormones during ovulation and the luteal phase, so primarily estrogen and progesterone. Now, you can have a hormone imbalance and PMDD, but so I was living with this for ages, going to physicians, getting misdiagnosed as bipolar, getting treated with antipsychotics, taking so many different forms of birth control, antidepressants, because those are the two primary treatments for PMDD. Even before PMDD was added to the DSM in 2013, it was SSRIs and hormonal birth control. SSRIs came in a little bit later, but tried all the things. Nothing helped me. A lot of them made things so much worse. And it really was a life or death situation. I was not experiencing any quality of life with 2 weeks of each month, in a deep despair. Dysphoric stands for kind of like a just total utter dissatisfaction. Different than apathy, although that's kind of present, but just disdain for life itself. And so when you're dealing with that up to 14 or more days, because the luteal phase can be 14 to 16 days, that's a lot of your life. So much time spent suffering. Yeah.
I imagine there's a buildup too, if you know half of the month is going to feel this way, where there's this buildup of anticipation of there's only 14 days of this month where I can feel okay.
Yeah, there's so much fear because, it's kind of like a light switches on and off and you're just kind of in it. And when you're in it, you're so in it that you can't really understand what's happening to you. So there's a lot of denial and confusion that's happening. And then when you come out of an episode like that, depending on how severe it is, it's not like, yes, you feel better, but it's not like your life just goes back to normal. You oftentimes have messes to clean up, whether they be figuratively or relationship messes. There's some damage control. So it's this really damaging cycle where people start to just fear their menstrual cycle. But what happens, and I think this is important to point out, is that because symptom onset can be at or right after ovulation, there's a misconception of this can't be my period because my period isn't for 2 weeks away from now. There's a because of the lack of reproductive health education, we don't understand the menstrual cycle. So it's kind of like there's a disconnect and people can't understand, oh, this actually is hormone related.
That was so helpful for me when I learned about the full cycle and I can never say these words. Words and me are not always friends. The luteal phase. Luteal phase.
Mhm.
Can you, for listeners who may not be familiar with the full kind of 28-day cycle, can you give a walkthrough of like those first 11, 14 days and then the luteal phase,
Yeah.
like hormonally?
Sure. So I like to start with the menstrual phase because that is, well, when we're tracking, that's cycle day 1 is day 1 of your period, but it's also the lowest point of hormones in the cycle. So it's kind of like a good place to start. The
That would be
hormones,
lowest estrogen and progesterone. Is that right?
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
There are other sex hormones, but primarily we're talking, even FSH and LH are low at that time, but I'm like drawing it on my desk over here.
I noticed
What
you're
am I doing?
oh my gosh, I would have to do that too. If I'm like asked a question that I'm trying to articulate, I would totally have to draw it out. I love that you're doing that.
Yeah. That's you do things and you're like, wow, I'm doing that. But it's the lowest point in the cycle of hormones. Your endometrial lining is shedding, obviously. And from there, they're building back up. So it can be broken down into 4 phases or 2 phases, like pre-ovulation, post-ovulation, or we can break it down into 4, which I think it's helpful to do.
I feel like we need a really good diagram of this to go with the show notes.
Yeah, I mean, does anybody ever share their screen? I have some too that I can give you.
Oh, we do
I
have a
could share my
YouTube
screen.
channel, which by the way, like I don't think our listeners actually know about that. That would be awesome. Are you cool with that, Patrick?
Yeah, I don't care. I'll make you a co-host, Jess.
Okay, let me.
Adding visualizations is always a good thing in my book.
Yeah. Well, I meant to ask because I have them pulled up here and I'm like, oh, but no one ever really does that. So let me find it.
Well,
here.
we don't really follow the norms either, so
I love it.
Did
Okay,
like
so
you were drawing that as you were talking, like you said, because that would totally be how I need to focus and pay attention. Is like, okay, how can I actually like bring this back to my thought process? So
yeah, I have to have visuals and it's so helpful. I mean, for anything. I guess I can just, let me see if I need to open this into.
yeah, Patrick, I've had people email to ask if we ever would consider doing video for like accessibility. And I'm like, yeah, here. I don't think people know that we have a YouTube version.
I probably need to start saying that when we sign off. Like, oh, check us out on YouTube. as well.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think when we're talking about like complex things like this, I don't know how people absorb it without a visual.
Agreed.
okay. Can you see that?
You can.
Mhm.
Okay. So when we're talking about the menstrual phase here, those hormones, so up here we can see hormones, estrogen, FSH, LH, and progesterone are the primary sex hormones that we talk about. And at menstruation, they're all at the lowest point. And this is also when we're looking at follicular development, which the follicle is what ovulates and then is fertilized and becomes an embryo. It hasn't started its development yet. There are also differences in body temperature throughout the menstrual cycle. And so the basal body temperature is lower. And when we're looking at cervical fluid, that changes as well. You're menstruating at this time, but otherwise there's not really generally a presentation of fertile cervical mucus. Then when you move into the follicular phase, which is the second phase, these hormones are starting to ramp up to push you towards ovulation. So preparing the egg to be ovulated, estrogen is rising. FSH is rising a little bit, and at ovulation, LH is going to peak. But there are changes in your endometrial changes, your cervix changes position. Again, your basal body temperature is kind of staying low during follicular. And you might start to notice a little bit of cervical fluid, but more is going to come in the ovulatory phase. So the ovulatory phase is only around 5 to 6 days, and that's when you can conceive. So a lot of times there's a misconception of like, oh, we can get pregnant anytime. You can. It's short. It's a short window. So this is when there are a lot of changes happening hormonally, as you can see here, and with ovulating that egg and cervical fluid changes and the basal body temperature rising. And then in luteal, this is the longest phase of the 4. And this is post-ovulation. So should you have conceived, this is the time where implantation is going to happen. Progesterone is rising to facilitate implantation, keeping that lining of the uterus intact. And then you go back to dry cervical fluid, but you do get a bump in basal body temperature. So there are a lot of physiological changes happening alongside those hormones. So hormones, I like to think of hormones as manipulators. They're manipulating your behavior. They're manipulating your physiology, what's happening in your body as well. So they're very powerful. But was that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. Can I ask, so one clarifying question for folks, I feel like people probably have a reference point for estrogen and progesterone, but LH, can you say a little bit about what that hormone is?
Yep. So LH is what signals the follicle release.
Okay.
So when estrogen is peaking, peak estrogen is reaching a high here, LH is going to come in and say, okay, it's time to release the egg into the fallopian tube. So that's LH's primary job, and it's a very short surge. And LH is a pituitary hormone, so it's coming from the brain, whereas estrogen and progesterone are ovarian hormones, so they're coming from the ovaries.
Got it. And does that have much impact on things like PMDD, that hormone, or is it more the estrogen and the progesterone?
I would be interested to see if it does, because a lot of people with PMDD are experiencing symptoms at ovulation or just after. The thing is, there's just not enough research on these hormones and PMDD, and also not enough studies on really tracking people's ovulation with markers to know, like, hey, when exactly is this onset? But we do see 2 peaks, or at least in the work that I'm doing, that's very common. And in some of the subtype studies that they've done, that's common as well. So maybe LH is playing a role. It might also just be peaking estrogen.
Sure. This is fascinating. Thank you for the science lesson. This is great. And we will, for those who are listening, would it be okay? Would you be comfortable with us, like this graphic you just showed us? Can we provide this as a
Please.
PDF?
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool.
I have more graphics if they're relevant later too.
Yeah, graphics are always relevant. So whatever you want to share with us, we will happily add to the mix. So
Awesome.
I noticed that your presentation in Canva was called ADHD and Hormones. So can we talk a little bit about ADHD and hormones in this whole concept?
Yeah. So it's so interesting, the impact that we're seeing with female hormones and ADHD in presentation with females. Now, it's crazy because there have been studies on females and ADHD since 1979, but there wasn't a study on females in the menstrual cycle, or ADHD in the menstrual cycle, until 2017.
Whoa.
So all that time, they're like, there are differences.
Yeah, we
Why?
get none of the research, or very little. We get very little of the research.
Yeah, so many things. Estrogen, what they're finding is that estrogen is a target hormone. Obviously, estrogen is a target hormone for the brain. And estrogen has some pretty crazy ties with dopamine. So that is where the connection is. When estrogen is high, it actually creates more dopamine receptors in the brain. So this is really, really important because it explains a lot of the misdiagnosis and undiagnosis in females with ADHD for so long, until they're getting into later reproductive years. And we're still learning so much about all of these things. I mean, it's we can sit here and be like, yeah, we know all this stuff, but it could also change. Like science, that's how science works. We learn more and we kind of change what we think. But the current research is showing that the estrogen has protective effects. So Obviously,
So
there are differences.
estrogen is helpful for dopamine. Okay.
Yes.
And dopamine is helpful for ADHD. Okay.
Yes.
I'm getting there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. So, what they're finding is that there are 4 stages of the reproductive continuum where estrogen drops and ADHD symptoms rise. And so that's why we see so much diagnosis in the perimenopause, menopausal community, because they've been able to be subclinical ADHD until the estrogen drops, and no longer can they continue masking, continue just getting through.
I see this all the time clinically. Yep, absolutely. That's another pregnancy, birth, and then menopause are times like hot times for identification of ADHD.
Yes, exactly. That's what they're finding. And puberty as well. Because with puberty comes the menstrual cycle. And then what happens when estrogen is high at ovulation and it drops during luteal, that's where the kind of PMDD, ADHD overlap, because again, estrogen is low at that point. And people really struggle. So there's some confusion sometimes around, is this PMDD or is this ADHD?
Mm-hmm.
Which is
that makes sense.
Fascinating.
Wait, that would make a great Venn diagram.
I have a Venn diagram.
Wait, you made one for that?
Yeah,
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
Okay, I forgot, but that's another graphic.
Yep.
I make Venn diagrams for everything with PMDD because it's so helpful. And even I made one for dehydration and it's insane.
Wait, dehydration? Like dehydration and PMDD? Oh, that's fast. Is it doing similar things to the body?
Yeah, it impacts everything.
Well, and ADHD and autistic people are dehydrated more because of it. Like if we have interoception awareness issues where we're not experiencing thirst. That's interesting.
Yes. So this is my Venn diagram currently. I'd change it as I learn more, but with ADHD and PMDD specifically.
Jess, is there a way to make that a little bigger with the bar at the bottom of your screen?
Oh, yes, I can.
Perfect.
Better?
Yep, perfect.
I think you can also hit the arrow, there's an arrow spread at the bottom right next to the question mark. And that might make it even. Or that might hit play if it's a video.
Is that better? Can you see that? Oh, no.
Yeah, that's great.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a ton of overlap there. I can see why there'd be a misdiagnosis for sure. Okay, so this is interesting. Both of these diagnoses often go unrecognized in females. So what do you have a thought on like which might get misdiagnosed as which more often? Like where ADHD might get misdiagnosed as PMDD or vice versa?
Well, it's more common for, I'm gonna stop sharing this. I can send you these though. It's more common for PMDD to be misdiagnosed as bipolar. That's the most common misdiagnosis.
That makes so much sense because of the cyclical nature of it.
Yep. And it's a mood disorder. So getting kind of wrapped up with other mood disorders, depending on how the PMDD is presenting in each individual, because sometimes the symptoms are different for everyone. That's more common. I wouldn't say that ADHD is, well, I think it is getting potentially misdiagnosed as PMDD and vice versa, but that comes down to a lack of understanding from practitioners diagnosing. Because, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you guys are more in the ADHD world, but what I've learned in my research is that the diagnosing for females with ADHD doesn't happen because of the emotional presentation. And when you look at the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, there are no emotional, it's not really about the emotion regulation.
Yeah, not in the States. I think the UK either has changed this or is talking about this to add emotional dysregulation to the core criteria. And yeah, clinicians who are kind of following the research ideally would know that, but you're right, it's not part of the criteria. And so absolutely, I think that can then lead someone toward, let's diagnose a mood disorder or a personality disorder, or yeah, absolutely.
Which is so common, right? A lot of times ADHD in females is getting diagnosed as anxiety or depression. That's the most, I would think, most common misdiagnosis for ADHD. But PMDD, even though it was added to the DSM in 2013, it's just kind of now surfacing.
Mm-hmm.
So now that people are learning more about it, I bet it will be misdiagnosed with PMDD, ADHD.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. Yeah, I could see that. Well, because we haven't even touched on that. I keep interrupting you to unpack these things, but we haven't even touched on that yet, is how ADHD, like the more difficult aspects of ADHD also get worse. Oh, you were starting to talk about that, and then I interrupted you to understand the estrogen dopamine connection. Those also get worse in that phase, partly because we don't have that dopamine support during that phase. So things like inattention, forgetfulness. Like, I know for me, and it's interesting to hear you talk about like the anxiety. And for me, it feels like more of like my first 11 days are good, but really it feels like I have like 5 good days of a cycle. And so I'm like, I have to get all my really complex work done in these 5 days because I know I'm going to lose my brain very soon. And so it can have this added pressure of like, I'm not going to be able to trust my brain for like 2 weeks out of the month.
Yeah, that's exactly what I hear from my clients, like word for word. That is the experience, the representation of the experience. And what they're finding, which is really interesting, I think too, is that because of how powerful estrogen is, some researchers even want to shift estrogen more into the neurotransmitter category, or at least along with the neurotransmitter because of how much it impacts dopamine and serotonin levels. But they're finding that, and they've known this for a while, but that when that estrogen drops in the luteal phase, your ADHD medication does not work as well. So not only are your symptoms worse, but you actually need to increase your dosage of ADHD medication during that time to compensate for progesterone and estrogen's impact on your
my
brain.
Goodness.
And
So then
I was just going to say, and good luck with like medication shortages or prescribers having a good understanding of that to be like, hey, yeah, boost up your dose during these 2 weeks or this amount of time. Like, that feels so challenging to have to track that all.
Yeah, and in order to do that effectively, you have to be tracking your menstrual cycle, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the conversation of, well, if you're on hormonal contraceptive, you're not having a menstrual cycle. So there's a whole nother thing going on there because you aren't menstruating. Even though you bleed, it's called a withdrawal bleed. It's not a true menstrual cycle. So there are so many nuances, and like there's that education is just, I would love that to reach physicians, but like it hasn't yet. So I'm not super hopeful.
Megan, I'm sorry, I don't know what you were about to say. Sorry to interrupt you.
I'm in the like losing my brain part of the month, so I don't know what I was gonna say either.
Apologies. But that's really something to think about too as we talk about ADHD more and more, as it's front and center and in the spotlight a lot of the time. And then we're talking about like medication shortages. We're talking about doctors being unwilling and to prescribe, or just not being able to see one in enough time, or not being able to get in with a psychiatric provider in enough time. Like, so really having to pay so much attention to your cycle, to pay so much attention to your mood fluctuation too, and your energy levels. And if you don't know this stuff, like, how would you ever catch up to that?
Absolutely. That's why I think education is the biggest piece. And people are constantly in my DMs or emailing me like, what's the solution? What's the solution? I'm like, the solution starts with education, because you're not going to be able to do anything without it. And people are, I mean, constantly like, you're not giving us enough tips and tricks. And like, what's the plan here? And it's like, there's so much more to the story. And every person is so individual that it's just not as simple as that. We just want the answer. But I think the positive reframe of that is the answer is the right answer for you is the right answer for you. And that's way better than me being like a physician and being like, these are the options: SSRIs, ADHD medication, hormonal contraceptives. Those are the only answers. Because that's what I ran into for so long, was this is the treatment that we have to offer you. This is what we're trained to do. This is what we offer. And I felt so personally victimized, and I felt so broken and messed up because those treatments didn't work for me, or they made things worse. And then I was told, just stay on them for longer. Like my suicidal ideation was increasing twofold. it's a dead end. And so the good news is actually that there are so many options, and they're going to be individual to your physiological drivers. And that's kind of where like my whole practice is built in, is looking at physiological drivers, because just like with PMDD, there are physiological drivers. There are physiological drivers between your ADHD presentation. And so let's learn about that. And then let's do some more testing as well. Because what I see with the problem with PMDD that I have, when it was added to the DSM in 2013, it left the medical field and entered mental health.
Yeah, I started, because I worked in an OB/GYN clinic and I started diagnosing it. That's so interesting. That really
that's
does
good.
change. But also but also there's such a biological component to it that, I didn't thought about that.
Yeah, I'm like entrenched in this right now because I haven't really publicly talked about this that much because it is kind of controversial, right? Because people will say, well, you know, I don't want them to misconstrue what I'm saying, because there are a lot of integrative physicians and practitioners and people doing similar work to me that have said in their books, on their blogs, like PMDD isn't a thing.
Wait, like it doesn't exist?
Well, and that's how I interpreted it, because they didn't elaborate.
Oh,
but
yeah,
I think
something like that and not elaborate.
Yeah, and of course it's not verbatim, but like some version of like PMDD was lobbied to be a diagnosis, and that's all true, you know. But I felt like they were saying, oh, this isn't a real thing. No, the symptoms are real. And this is where I'm coming from now, but I want to give more of that background disclaimer. PMDD, the symptoms are real. They're extremely debilitating, life like damaging in so many ways. But when it's relegated to mental health, we're not doing routine testing or in-depth testing. And when we are doing that testing, it's through an allopathic lens, which their ranges are different than integrative medicine because they're treating disease and working on a disease model where we're looking at optimal health. So I run labs, and I'll have all these clients come to me, we'll run labs, and they'll be like, I've been told everything is normal. And then we run all these labs, and it's like, well, here are like 10 things that I'm seeing from my perspective that could be impacting these symptoms, which is super validating. But I'm gone to tangent, but like the allopathic dead end with PMDD, I think comes partly because it was moved over to mental health. And so they're just referring, go to counseling, you know, when there are major drivers, like we talked about dehydration, which is so simplistic, but for every cell to function in your body optimally, you have to be hydrated, and hormones communicate via cells. So if you're dehydrated, those hormones can't do what they need to do, and they can't detox. And when estrogen, which is very common, is in the liver after it's been used and trying to get detoxed, and then you're symptomatic and you're impulsive and you're drinking a lot of coffee to try to cope, and you're obviously alcohol was what I meant before that, but then you're like binge eating because your insulin is dysregulated by those estrogen changes. And if you're sensitive to the shift, you're probably going to be sensitive to the insulin shifts as well, because insulin is a hormone. I'm like going off here, but when
really interesting.
Well, this is fascinating. I'm please keep going.
No, this reminds me of our episode with Mel, where like
you and Bolson are like,
yeah, no, like I'm having a lot of connecting moments. So yeah, keep going. This is really interesting.
Well, what's so common is that the liver detoxifies estrogen. Again, I'm like holding my liver while I'm saying this. The liver detoxifies estrogen. If it can't, because it's like, oh, hold on, I have these exogenous toxins, endocrine disrupting chemicals I'm putting on my skin, or water quality, or alcohol, or caffeine, or processed foods, which a lot of us, especially ADHD and PMDD, are going to. And then we have disordered eating because of ADHD, which is like causing all sorts of insulin and glucose problems. But the estrogen that was supposed to be detoxed out of your system through the bowel, that's how these hormones leave the system, your liver has to process these other toxins. So what happens is the estrogen is then reabsorbed back into your bloodstream as a free radical.
Oh.
And it's just like, I'm going to ruin your life. That's a simple term. Yeah. So this is like,
so
illogical.
I'm just totally leading with my, like, I feel like this is like estrogen for dummies. Like I'm leading with all of my, like, what might be simplistic questions, but I'm assuming listeners might have these too. So estrogen is good for dopamine, but when it is the kind that sits in the liver and then it gets reabsorbed into the bloodstream, that's bad because can you break that down?
Yep. So basically a free radical like is disconnected. It's a bond situation. So like I can't remember what atom it's bound to like make it stable, but it doesn't have that atom anymore. And so it's just like going around your body causing problems. Now, estrogen, too much of anything is a bad thing, right? So because of the environmental state of the world, because of how many stressors we have now, a lot of environmental factors, we all kind of have too much estrogen. I mean, that's like an oversimplification and generalization, but like that's pretty common. So too much estrogen, even if it's just too much estrogen in combination to progesterone, because what happens is estrogen and progesterone are steroid hormones. So they're made from cholesterol, which is fats. So you're getting all of this through essential fatty acids in your diet. So when I'm talking about physiological drivers as a nutritional therapist, I'm always going to go food first. But the problem with food first is that our soils are depleted. We're using a lot of chemicals. We're using chemicals just in our homes. Everything is made from chemical. Like it's driving estrogen higher and higher and higher. And so that creates an imbalance to progesterone. Also because stress, cortisol, is also made from cholesterol. So instead of making progesterone, your body, this is an adaptive mechanism, your body will make cortisol. Like, never mind progesterone, we're in a stress state, we need cortisol. And that's an adaptive mechanism, which is also super cool because think about it. If we were in wartime, there was a famine.
We'd actually need that. Yeah. But we don't actually need the extra cortisol because, well, and I talk about this a lot because I talk about the stress system a lot. Like our nervous system doesn't know the difference between like a true threat and like, I just got a bunch of hate comments on my post. Like, right, my body is going to release cortisol in the same way. So in modern life, like we release so much cortisol. And so the body's constantly, like, okay, we're going to redirect this resource to create cortisol instead of progesterone. That's so interesting. You know, when I had, adrenal fatigue in my early 30s after the birth of both my kids. And I went to a naturopath who prescribed progesterone as part of my treatment for that. And part of it was my cortisol was just so freaking high. So that's really interesting, that connection.
Yeah. So I definitely went on a tangent, but I think my point is that you have more options, right? If you go an allopathic route and you're told and you're experiencing these symptoms and you're told, hey, these are the two options, that's it. Those are the two options that practitioner is trained to offer. That doesn't mean those are the only two options for you because I didn't understand that. And so that kept me stuck and sick for almost 2 decades. Like I couldn't keep a job. I couldn't, I lost my housing numerous times. I was on food stamps. Like I wanted to do all these things, get married, grow my own vegetables. Like, I had aspirations and that was never going to be a possibility. Like it was just not an option because I was completely dysfunctional for 2 weeks of every month. Like can't get out of bed, can't feed myself, crying uncontrollably, like, self-harming, disordered eating, like all of the same things we experience with ADHD. And recognizing that regardless of whether or not it's PMDD, because there's no blood test, there's no urine test, there's no saliva test, genetic or imaging test to say, Megan, you definitely have PMDD. That's what it is. It's a diagnosis through exclusion. So they run all of those labs. Sometimes they don't, more commonly. And then they say, oh, everything's normal because we have this super wide range and your labs you're not in a disease state according to our standards. So you're fine, right? Or maybe you get the PMDD diagnosis. But just like the ADHD diagnosis, it doesn't tell you why it's happening. It's just a collection of symptoms. So it's more like this can be useful because now I have an understanding of like what's happening. I just don't know why it's happening. And for both of these conditions, obviously, they're very different, but there are things that drive ADHD symptoms to be worse, whether it be estrogen or whether it be chemicals in your environment or stress. You know, all of that impacts our symptoms with ADHD as well. So kind of like zooming out when you're trying to look at how to manage these and take that approach rather than feeling like there's nothing that's going to help me.
Yeah. I'm having so many feelings right now listening to you talk. I have just a handful of times I worked with PMDD during my training years, and again I was in an OBGYN clinic, so very like Western medicine, and it was like, okay, first line of treatment, and when you kind of medical providers will often talk about like first line, second line, third line. First line of treatment, exactly what you're saying, kind of SSRIs, maybe hormonal. And then for mental health, there's often like, well, let's talk about like, you want to plan for those 2 weeks. But I often had kind of a feeling of powerlessness when working with these clients, because it was like, this is not enough to be like, let's create a safety plan for 2 weeks out of the month. And let's like, make sure you rest. Like, it's just like, and I think it's exactly what you're hitting on is this is not purely a mental health condition. And so it is, we are coming at it very one-dimensionally when we treat it as such. Yeah, I'm just like, wow, this is what we need. The people I'm learning the most from right now in my life are functional medicine providers, integrative providers, like people who are really thinking holistically about the body and the mental health. Yeah. This is fascinating.
It's so true. And I mean, I think it's such a positive take because, you know, we're just not taught about our bodies, but really even just looking at glucose, if we just talk about ADHD and glucose control, you can transform your experience with both of those conditions, PMDD and ADHD, by regulating your glucose levels, because those are major drivers behind mood symptoms. And like no one ever, 17 years going to physicians, no one even ever ran my A1C or fasting blood glucose test, which those can come back normal and you can still be dealing with glucose issues. You just don't have diabetes. But like, it's just when you get into the physiology, it's like it's like a weighted blanket. You're like, oh, obviously, makes so much more sense.
I love the idea of like education as a weighted blanket. I often feel that way of like, once I can understand something, it's like, oh, I can contain it now and I know what I'm working with. It's really soothing. Yeah. I am curious. Okay. And I know that it is individual to every person, but I am curious how your story got here, right? Like, so 17 years, it was not working. What changed? How did you, like, something obviously significant shifted in your life?
Yep. So I hit rock bottom. I had the progression was things were not going well. I was going to get back into relationships with somebody that I had been on and off with for 5 years. It was very tumultuous. He was going to move to where I lived. And I was like, I don't want to mess this up. So I went to my physician. I said, I have severe PMS. And she was like, okay, we're going to put you back on the birth control that you were on for like 10 years. Because you seemed fine on that. Well, I had no I had no education. I had no way of tracking my moods. Like, I was not okay during that time. But also, just because you take a medication this year, you take it next year, it doesn't mean it's going to impact you the same. Like, your body is constantly changing. So I went back on that medication and it made my symptoms so much worse. So I went from 2 weeks of having symptoms to the entire month. I had to wear 2 bras because my breasts were so swollen and tender that like I couldn't move.
Wow.
Like, it was gnarly. And then I like systematically just destroyed my entire life during that 3-month period. Lost the relationship, lost my housing, lost jobs, just everything in like a really nasty mood disorder type of way, right? We always talk about these things and it's like, well, what does it really look like? It looks like cheating on the people that you love in a nasty, destroying type of behavior, like doing illegal things, like screaming at people, you know, like not being able to get out of bed. Like the behaviors are pretty dramatic. And at that point, I was just like, I can't do this anymore. Like I'm going to die because this is not living, or I have to figure something else out. And so that is when I started experimenting with integrative menstrual health protocols. And within 3 months, primarily dietary related, but within 3 months, I had a symptom-free period for the first time in my life.
That's fast.
Fast.
Like 3 months. What do you think about like healing the body? And after 17 years, wow.
It was like one of the best and worst moments of my life at the same time, because at that point, you guys talk a lot about like grief and shame. Like with that came this realization of, one, like, oh, can I cuss?
Yeah, you can swear here.
Okay. Like, oh shit, this is how people get doctorate degrees. This is how people are married. This is how people have children at my age and own homes.
Yeah. Wow.
This is how, because their periods come and they haven't just wrecked their entire life beforehand over and over and over and over. So it was beautiful and like very, like a lot of grief I had to go through because it seemed so simple. You know, it didn't mean that I didn't have any symptoms ever again, but like the way I was able to manage them moving forward and then continuing to build that knowledge, like my parents are just like in awe. Like every time I see them, my dad's like crying, like, I can't believe that you've been able to do this. Like, because it was so painful for them to watch this happen over and over and feel like they were going to lose me every month. My mom on the phone, like, just wait 3 more days. Just, you can get through 3 more days. Your period is going to come, you know, like literally talking me off the ledge. And it was at that point where I was like, I have to like scream this from the rooftops because this is bullshit.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And now I have over 500 students. I'm working with, you know, clients all over the world, and they're reducing these symptoms and learning to better manage them. And they're better mothers and better, you know, partners, and achieving like in careers and starting yoga studios, like fulfilling their dreams in ways that they truly believed were impossible for them. Just like my experience. So it's pretty intense.
It's so powerful. I mean, it just sounds so liberating to be, and to be able to fully flourish because, I'm struggling with words right now, but it sounds so incredibly powerful.
It's wild when you recognize like the power is really in the hormones, right? Because you think like, same with ADHD, like I'm broken, like I'm just not trying hard enough, like, you know, all of these this negative inner self-talk that's happening. And then you really start to learn about your body and you're like, oh, there are like some extenuating factors here that are really impacting my mood.
Well, and I think this is where like I get stuck here, and I think this is tricky, where either with ADHD or autism, there is some acceptance of like, okay, my body's going to be more fatigued, or like there's acceptance of like, this is part of my baseline. But I think sometimes we accept things that we shouldn't because there are these other conditions happening, like PMDD, or just even because of our sensitivity to hormones, there's lifestyle things that we could do, not to cure the ADHD or the autism, but to support our more vulnerable systems. And that's something in this last year, I've been having kind of an awakening of like, oh, wait, there's things I've been attributing to like my sensory sensitivities and fatigue that actually I think I could support these differently and live with a different degree of freedom in my life. So I think that's a really interesting piece too, when we throw in ADHD and autism, is we can diagnostically overshadow these other health conditions And I do want to, it's interesting. I do want to put PMDD in the health conditions category. Um, by thinking like this is just part of ADHD or this is just part of autism.
Well, and there is another factor, a lack of reproductive health education and understanding around you will feel differently during different phases of your cycle. That's not a pathology, like that's biology. But if it's debilitating you at any point, whether that be physically or psychologically, it is a vital sign. Like in 2015, the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Academy of Obstetricians and Gynecologists named the menstrual cycle as the 5th vital sign. So right up there with your respiratory rate, your body temperature, all of that. This is actually a tool to tell us information about how our body is functioning. So much in-depth information if you learn how to interpret it. And you can start to do that by just learning about your menstrual cycle, which we haven't done. But something else I wanted to point out, which is interesting, and these studies are small and there needs to be more of them. But the study on autism and mood disorder with the menstrual cycle was in 2008, which is before PMDD was called PMDD. It was called late luteal dysphoric disorder. Yeah. And the study showed 92% of people with autism, females with autism, experience severe premenstrual symptoms that could fall in the PMDD category. And then more recent study on ADHD and PMDD is saying around 46% of people with ADHD, females with ADHD, are experiencing severe mostly psychological symptoms related to the menstrual cycle. But why would that be any surprise to us if both of these are sensitivity, conditions, right? To brain chemicals. It's all happening in there. So I just wanted to share those statistics. They're not perfect and we need more research, but those are huge numbers to start out with.
That is so huge. Yeah. So huge. Oh, I'm having an association. So I talk a lot about how BPD, borderline personality disorder, is a common misdiagnosis for autism. And I bet if you threw in, especially autistic females, I bet if you threw in PMDD, that would be another reason why that could look like BPD. And then Patrick and I have talked about this. Bipolar is also, it can co-occur at higher rates for both autistic and ADHD people, but also that's another common misdiagnosis, which again, I wonder if PMDD is like part of the mechanism of that misdiagnosis as well. Huh.
Likely so. There are nuances to them all, but there's so much overlap. Like, I will make you a Venn diagram, Megan, for all them all.
Please do. I love a good Venn diagram. Yeah, absolutely. This has been so fascinating. Are there things we haven't hit on or asked you that you're like, your brain is itching, like, oh, I want to make sure and say this one thing?
I was just looking at my notes to think if there was anything else. I feel like we did a great job, like hitting the main points. I think the only other thing that I would encourage people to do, your listeners, when we're looking at like, how do I sort all of this out, is to do what I called symptom mapping, which I can again share my screen and show you what that looks like, because obviously it's visual. But a lot of us are familiar with cycle tracking, right? Where we like go in and we record our cycle days and all of that. It's pretty like minimal. And maybe you record some symptoms, but it's generally not mood related. These apps aren't specifically mood related. And so this can really help you navigate both ADHD and PMDD, the symptom mapping process. And it's a visual, you're visually creating a graph of your symptoms throughout the month. So I'll show you an example of one that's filled out. So we have a blank sheet for you. This is just a free resource. And then here is like an example of someone filling one out. And so cycle day 1, the first day you have your period, is when you would start filling it out, and then you would put the date. So this would be December 2022. This person filled this out, and their period started on December 17th. And then you're going in and you are using our symptom list. This is specifically for PMDD, but you could include your ADHD symptoms or just do your ADHD symptoms if you want to see how they change throughout the cycle. And you write them on this axis. And then here we have mild, moderate, severe, or none. And you're just going in and you're coloring in this box. So it creates a graph of how severe your symptoms are and what the pattern is throughout the menstrual cycle. So this is really helpful for people with PMDD because they can learn their pattern of, hey, you know, I'm really noticing an onset of symptoms, like for this person is around day like 12, 13. Okay, now that I know that, I can prepare for that. And, you know, if I know I'm really depressed in my luteal phase, I'm probably not going to schedule job interviews during that time or plan my wedding, you know. But then we can also use this to see representations of PME. So that would be PME, ADHD would be premenstrual exacerbation. Are you familiar with that? It's characterized as a core premenstrual disorder, but it's kind of funny. It's basically just like a disorder where any other condition that you're experiencing gets worse during your period.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah,
so
that
like
makes sense.
ADHD, your autism symptoms, bipolar symptoms, any other like depression, anxiety. So say that was kind of happening all month, but then it got worse at your period. That would be like, oh, hey, that's ADHD, or that's pointing more toward not just PMDD, because PMDD only happens around the luteal phase. But in here, you're also able to write down your protocols of things you're doing to help manage. So like movement with ADHD is big, looking at balancing your blood sugar with ADHD, like putting some of those things in here so you can track when you're doing them. And then down here, you're writing anything that happens that could impact your cycle, whether it be this particular menstrual cycle. So this is a little bit of reproductive health education that I think is important to share, is that the follicle, I showed you that graph of the follicle that ovulates, that takes around 90 days for that follicle to be prepared to ovulate. So anything that happens from today, 90 days ago, could impact my menstrual cycle this cycle. So a lot of times we have a really bad menstrual cycle and we're like, what happened this month, you know, or this last cycle? When, hey, maybe we got fired from our job 2 months ago and that stress is still impacting us, you know, 3 cycles later. So you're basically just recording anything that can impact your cycle, medications, stress, illness, and you're just keeping this on hand. And you don't have to do this forever, but doing this for 3 months can be so helpful to start to see, hey, is there a pattern with these mood symptoms that follow along with my menstrual cycle? Because a lot of the ADHD symptoms in females are mood related.
Yeah, I could see how that would be super helpful. And I like that it's like, do this for 3 months. Because I think if it felt like I have to do this every month for an ADHD, it's like, wait, no, come on.
Not going to happen. And you can do it digitally too, for those of us that are less analog. But yeah, even if doing it for 2 months, like you can learn a lot about yourself and your cycle that can be like really shocking by just recording more in-depth information and being able to see it represented like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fascinating stuff. I feel like I added a lot to this conversation today, and yeah, no, that was really enlightening. My wife struggled with PMDD for quite some time, so I was just really interested in just hearing this experience too. So thank you for sharing that and for being vulnerable enough to share it publicly too.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks, Megan. Thanks for having me, creating a space to raise more awareness about the experience, because one of the latest, well, not latest, but one of the statistics I saw was like 90% of PMDD is undiagnosed. So a lot of people are suffering with this and just, again, feeling similar like the ADHD, like something's wrong with me and I just don't know what it is. And why can't I just be normal? And it's like, oh, there's something going on.
Yeah.
Well, Jess, I feel like we're at our awkward goodbye stage where Megan and I just kind of look at each other in our peripherals and we're like, are we there yet? So I think that's where we're at. Can you share with the audience where they can find you, where you have all these great resources? Because you have a lot of wonderful resources on your Insta, and we'll link all of that stuff to the show notes too.
Thank you. Yes. We're most active on Instagram currently. I'm trying to move over to doing more long form content on YouTube, so you can check us out there. Her Mood Mentor is the name of our virtual premenstrual clinic, so you can just type that into the search bar and find us anywhere. But yeah, all of those resources are linked both on YouTube and on Instagram, and I would love to chat with you in the DMs if you have any questions or want to share your story with me. I would love to hear more from you.
Love it. We'll have all of that stuff linked to the show notes so that everyone has easy access to all of Jess's information. And Jess, thanks for so much for coming on and making the time and sharing this story and all this information. That was unbelievably illuminating and really, really helpful.
Well, thank you, Patrick. And thank you again. Thanks for creating the space. It was so fun.
Yeah, thank you so much. Oh,
sorry.
Just interject an awkward thank you. You just wrap us up, Patrick.
One of our reviews was like, what did it say? Like delightfully awkward and just feel good. And you're like, that's what I'm bringing to the table.
Yeah, that's all me.
I will remember to add our YouTube in what I'm about to say. I'll probably botch it again because I'm thinking about it too much now. To everyone listening to Divergent Conversations, we have new episodes out on every single Friday on all major podcast platforms and YouTube if you want to watch the video recordings. Like, download, subscribe, and share. And we will see you next week. Bye.